They tried to kill it before it took its first breath. Not a man, not a government, a passport. 3 poor landlocked African nations dared to print their own future, and the world went into panic mode. Within 48 hours, headlines screamed, AES passport rejected. No entry to Europe. Even China slams the door. But none of it was true. The AES passport didn't break international law. It didn't cause a diplomatic crisis. It broke something more fragile, the illusion that Africa still needed permission. So what do you do when a symbol of freedom threatens the balance of power? You drown it. In doubt. In January 2025, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, the new alliance of Sahel states, unveiled a single biometric passport. It was more than a travel document. It was a declaration, one currency, one judiciary, one identity. And to those who still believe Africa must kneel, that passport was a declaration of war. So the counterattack came swiftly, not with sanctions, not with soldiers, with stories, headlines designed to humiliate, rumors whispered like truth. It's invalid. No one recognizes it. You've been lied to. And suddenly, millions of proud Africans who held that passport in their hand started to wonder if it was already worthless. But here's what no headline dared admit. The AES passport was real. What wasn't real was the fear. So ask yourself, if a piece of paper with a flag and a chip can shake empires, what are they so afraid of? Because if the only weapon they need to destroy your sovereignty is a lie, then maybe your freedom was never theirs to give. If you believe in stories buried beneath the headlines, in leaders who don't kneel, and a continent rewriting its future, this is your story too. Subscribe now. And tell me, was it just a passport or a revolution printed in blue ink? The day Africa printed its own future, January 2025, under the harsh sun of Ouagadougou, a quiet revolution unfolded. No shots were fired, no borders crossed, just a line of citizens, miners, teachers, mothers, waiting patiently to receive something the world said they were never supposed to hold, a passport. But this was no ordinary passport. It bore no logo of ECOWAS, no symbols of colonial legacy, just the proud mark of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES. 3 nations long dismissed as unstable, irrelevant, or poor had done the unthinkable. They had created their own identity. Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. Together, they had left ECOWAS. Together, they had expelled foreign troops. And now, together, they would issue a new document, one that did not ask for permission to exist. It was called AES Passport, launched with ceremony and steel. The passport wasn't symbolic, it was fully legal. The ministers of security from all 3 nations declared that biometric data had been submitted to the International Civil Aviation Organization. Samples had been sent to foreign embassies. Consular channels were informed. The system had been updated. The world was notified. And still, the world did not want to see. Because to many in Brussels, Paris, and Washington, the message behind the AES passport was louder than the paper it was printed on. It was a message of defiance, a message that said, "We no longer speak your language of dependence." And for some, that was intolerable. That's why they moved quickly, not with tanks, but with timelines. Headlines began popping up within days of the launch. AES passport not recognized by France. China denies AES entry. Sahel travel document already useless. No sources, no nuance, just certainty, repeated loud enough to drown out the facts. But facts don't whisper. In official records, Chinese embassies acknowledged the new passport and cited only technical onboarding delays. No formal rejection was issued. France had not banned it. European systems simply had not yet updated the document into their software. Yet the damage was already done, because in a world ruled by headlines, the first impression is the only impression. And so, the image spread. Africa tried to stand and fell. But those who stood in line that January morning knew better. They knew what it meant to hold a passport made not in Europe, but at home. They didn't need the approval of foreign papers to feel the weight of independence in their hands. It wasn't about travel, it was about truth. And that truth was dangerous. Dangerous to those who built their empires on the myth that Africa can't function without them. Dangerous to those who think legitimacy must be granted from the outside. You see, the AES passport was never about what doors it could open. It was about the door it slammed shut, the door of dependency. And for the first time in decades, 3 African nations had printed their own future and dared the world to look them in the eye. What happened next would show who was truly afraid. When doubt becomes a weapon, it started with silence, not from the streets of Bamako or the schools of Niamey, but from the embassies. Students who had applied to universities in Paris began receiving vague messages, documentation under review. Traders heading to Brussels were told to postpone appointments. Families seeking urgent medical visas to Istanbul were asked to wait. The AES passport, just weeks old, was being quietly questioned, not rejected, just suspended in limbo. And in limbo, fear grows fast. News outlets pounced. Articles quoted unnamed officials, half-translated statements, and blog posts as fact. France says passport invalid. China rejects Sahel entry. No AES citizen admitted since January. In Ouagadougou cafes and Niamey buses, murmurs turned into doubt. Had their leaders gone too far, too fast? For opposition parties across the Sahel, the moment was golden. Critics accused Traoré, Goïta, and Tiani of reckless theater. A paper passport doesn't mean sovereignty, they sneered. Western think tanks echoed the sentiment. One headline read, Sahel's military illusion of nationhood. Even in neighboring African nations, hesitation spread. Ghanaian and Senegalese diplomats asked, will travelers from AES need special screening? The idea of a collapsing alliance was whispered louder than its creation ever had been. But amidst the rising noise, something else began to stir. It came not from governments, but from people. In Bamako, student associations organized open forums. In Ouagadougou, young entrepreneurs released infographics debunking the myths. They explained the difference between technical delays and diplomatic rejection. They challenged the headlines, line by line, and then came the embassy's corrections. On February 26th, the Chinese embassy released a formal statement. The AES passport is valid. Any delay is due to system integration, not political rejection. European consulates followed, clarifying that no country had banned the document. The problem wasn't political, it was procedural. Still, the damage had already seeped deep. In information wars, corrections are whispers, lies shout first and loudest. Yet in this storm, something unexpected happened. People didn't retreat, they resisted. Passport applications surged, up nearly 30% in March. For every citizen who hesitated, 2 more stepped forward. They weren't just applying for travel. They were making a statement that they would not be shamed for claiming their own identity. President Traoré seized the moment. In a televised address, he looked directly into the camera and said, "We will not beg for recognition. We are the ones who define it." His words echoed across a continent tired of conditional respect. For a brief moment, the AES became more than a union of nations. It became an idea that Africa could speak for itself, print its own name, choose its own borders, write its own future in black ink on blue paper, and the world saw it. Some applauded, some feared, but no one could ignore it. So let me ask you, if fear of a passport can cause this much chaos, what does that say about the power of the people who created it? Ink on paper, or a verdict on trust? In Niamey, a student named Idris held his brand new AES passport. He once dreamed of studying engineering in Lyon, but after reading an article from Le Monde, he wasn't sure anymore. If they don't accept it, should I just give up? That question wasn't his alone. It echoed in the hearts of thousands across the Sahel. In Bobo Dioulasso, a mother prepared to take her son, who had a heart condition, to Casablanca for treatment. Her concern wasn't medical, it was customs. Would they shake their heads at the AES passport? Across the three nations, questions like these became daily struggles. No official had rejected the passport outright, but the world's hesitation had planted uncertainty. And when people can't trust the document in their hands, they start to doubt the dream it represents. This was the first consequence, a crisis of trust. Not just trust in the passport, but in themselves. Because when the world loudly denies your legitimacy, you begin to silently question your own. The opposition seized the moment. They held press conferences, forums, interviews. They called the AES passport a militarized illusion of nationhood, a political prop. They accused the leadership of printing national honor on paper without securing global recognition. In Bamako, long silent politicians began challenging the administration about the diplomatic costs of the AES experiment. In Ouagadougou, a few civil society groups called for a suspension of the passport rollout until the EU gave formal acknowledgement. From within, cracks began to form. But what no opponent or ally expected was this. The reaction wasn't just outrage. It was awareness. In Niamey, youth groups held public workshops on international aviation law, explaining the role of ICAO and the passport recognition process. In Burkina Faso, independent journalists began investigating the source of the earliest disinformation articles. And then, something remarkable happened. People stopped demanding recognition. They started demanding clarity. Doubt did not turn into division. It turned into political consciousness. Citizens didn't walk away from the AES. They leaned in. Because they understood, if a document could be used as a weapon to divide, then they themselves had to become the shield. President Ibrahim Traoré understood this. In a closed meeting, he told his advisors, "We are not just printing travel documents. We are reprinting the will of a free people." And with every citizen who still applied for the AES passport, every person who refused to believe false headlines, every question raised in cafes, classrooms, and marketplaces, that vision was slowly becoming reality. Because in the end, sovereignty cannot be defended with slogans. It must be guarded by knowledge, by understanding, and by the courage to ask questions when the world demands silence. So let me ask you, if a single piece of paper can shake a nation's trust in itself, what does that say about the power we give to perception? If you believe that should never happen again, subscribe now. Because here, we refuse to let the truth disappear in the noise. Why the West hears echoes of Moscow in Africa's voice in Washington. The AES passport wasn't treated as paperwork. It was treated as a signal, one that made analysts uneasy. At think tanks from D.C. to London, a quiet alarm rang. Africa is no longer asking. Suddenly, every move by Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso was framed through a Cold War lens. Russia's influence, headlines muttered. Moscow backed disinformation, whispered others. Western diplomats speculated that the media chaos following the AES passport launch had fingerprints from the Kremlin. To them, African defiance couldn't be homegrown. It had to be orchestrated. This framing revealed more than it intended. Because buried inside those suspicions was a deeply uncomfortable truth. Much of the West still believes African resistance must come with a foreign sponsor. That sovereignty doesn't come naturally from within, but must be injected from outside. In Brussels, EU officials held briefings warning of a strategic vacuum forming in the Sahel. U.S. policymakers cautioned that the withdrawal of French troops and the rise of independent institutions like the AES Central Bank or the passport signaled a destabilizing shift. But destabilizing to whom? To the people of the Sahel, who had gone decades without meaningful infrastructure, security, or representation, or to the foreign powers who had long shaped that vacuum to their own benefit. African commentators weren't fooled. Across Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa, journalists called out the double standard. When the West consolidates, it's called unity. One editorial read, "When Africans do it, it's called fragmentation." In East Africa, voices began asking, why wasn't the West celebrating regional integration? Why were African-led solutions automatically viewed as threats? Meanwhile, in Asia and Latin America, the AES passport stirred quiet curiosity. In Brazil, a foreign policy analyst wrote that Africa's diplomatic maturity is finally visible. In India, some saw the passport as a litmus test. If the world truly believed in multipolarity, then it would welcome new centers of power, not fear them. Back in Washington, some American observers did begin to shift tone. A few called for more respect and less reflex. One academic wrote, "If a document like the AES passport can generate such global noise, maybe it's not the document we should be questioning, but our own assumptions." And that's the heart of the story. The AES passport exposed more than paperwork. It exposed discomfort about who gets to define legitimacy, about whose story gets believed, about who still needs permission to rise. Now, the world is watching, not just to see if the passport works, but if it holds. But let's turn the lens back on us. Why do you think a simple document caused this much turbulence? Was it the paper or what it represented? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments. Let's talk about the power of symbols and what they make the world afraid to admit. One passport, 3 nations, and a future that asks no permission. On an old wooden desk in a small office in Ouagadougou, a data clerk quietly enters the 100,000th AES passport application. No fireworks. No international congratulations. But outside, the line keeps growing, because for them, this is no longer a journey to the world, it's a journey to existence. From Mali to Niger, from Burkina Faso to the border towns, a ripple effect has begun. Countries that once hesitated are now sending quiet delegations to study the AES model. Guinea has convened closed-door meetings on a Sahelian monetary future. Togo is discreetly reviewing its consular treaties. Scholars are calling it the sovereignty domino effect. The West calls it a risk. But for the people here, it is hope. Though AES is still young, what it has achieved in just 18 months exceeds every forecast. The expulsion of foreign military presence, the founding of a joint central bank, the creation of a regional court, and now the issuance of a travel document officially recognized by ICAO. This is not an administrative feat. It is a stress test of national nerves, a trial of endurance between the will of 3 nations and the doubt of the global order. And AES has not bent. Now, the question is no longer, can AES survive, but who joins next? across the heart of Africa. This wave is no longer just a Sahel project. It is becoming a new language, the language of peoples who have been told what to do for too long and are now writing their own answers. Will it endure? Can it survive elections, the next crisis, or covert pressure? No one knows for sure. But as one journalist from Burkina Faso wrote, once you've dared to print your own name on paper, you'll never accept being rewritten by someone else's hand. Not a document, a declaration. Years from now, historians may debate what truly marked the turning point for Africa's modern independence. Some will cite speeches, others will point to military withdrawals. But a few, perhaps the ones who understand symbols, will trace it back to a passport, not because of where it could take you, but because of what it dared to say. We exist. Without your permission. The AES passport was never meant to change flight paths. It was meant to change the direction of thought. It told young Africans, you do not need a Western signature to define your worth. It told world powers, this continent is no longer submitting forms. It is writing history. And like all declarations of self, it provoked fear, not because it threatened borders, but because it threatened narratives. This is what made the passport dangerous, not the paper, not the chip inside, but the idea it carried. Now, in 2025, that idea is still fragile. It breathes through uncertainty, walks through bureaucratic delays, and stumbles in the face of global skepticism. But it walks, and as long as it walks, it will reach others. What began in Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou will not stop at the airport gates. It will move across Africa through currencies, courts, schools, and dreams. And it will ask one question. Are you ready to stop asking for permission? Because the future does not belong to those who wait to be accepted. It belongs to those who stand up, even if their voice shakes. So, if you felt something in this story, if you believe a passport can carry more than just a name, if you think Africa's voice deserves more than whispers, then subscribe. Not just to this channel, but to an idea. That sovereignty can be handwritten. That freedom begins with a document you do not apologize for. And that stories like this, untold, buried, misrepresented, deserve a place in the light. This is not the end. This is page 1.